Ukrainian opera? Is there such a thing?
Well, no, there is.
Does it have the prevalence that it, you know?
Yeah, it is. I mean, it's much newer than the other countries. I mean, in terms of opera, the operas that were composed would be by composers in what we would call end of Baroque into classical era, but they were Ukrainian by birth and training, in a sense, as young members of the chorus that were trained in a school, special school in Lviv, which was in eastern Ukraine, and which would be Bortnyansky and Berezovsky. They wrote operas. And then in the 19th century there were others, but there was not very much, because for one thing, there really weren't theaters for them.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't mean that there weren't theaters, but it was essentially dedicated to Russian and European operas, and in very little national, because at that point in time there really weren't that wasn't there.
Mm-hmm.
So, but that changed rather radically, very much so. But it changed beginning with, I would say, 1905, and the first sort of important, I think one would say, potentially important composer was somebody like Nicola Lysenko, and then others, Arkas and so on, who wrote operas. But it began to change, go in a different direction with 1905, which was a kind of a crisis in the Russian Empire, which led eventually to the Soviet or Communist Revolution.
Mm-hmm.
So in 1917, that's when it started bubbling. And that's when you really had, for the first time, a sense of a Ukrainian nation. It was became one of the republics of the early years of Soviet Union. And they were very busy in creating operatic performances, but also translating them into Ukrainian, meaning that they would do Aida in Ukrainian and so on and so on. Because in Europe, the tendency was very much so in the 19th century to perform whatever opera they brought in from, let's say, from Italy
Mm-hmm.
into France, it would do it in French. Not only that, Verdi would go so far as to put it in 5 acts, because that was their tradition,
Right.
for romantic scenes, and tough add new materials, sometimes, and all of that. Probably the best example is Don Carlos. So, and then there was a whole, not flood, but a lot of, almost every composer started writing operas. So probably a couple of hundred operas by now. I mean, that doesn't sound like a lot. I mean, but it is, if you think of it, that it started in the 1920s.
Yeah, that's not very much time.
Yeah, and because of the peculiarities of the political situation. So my answer to that is, yeah, and there's also right now a lot of very highly experimental operas.
Mm-hmm.
As a matter of fact, they performed one in New York very recently. I mean really recently, like a couple of weeks ago. And the composer of that will be also part of the fifth Ukrainian Contemporary Music Festival in New York, which will be March 28, 29, and 30th.
Okay.
And so there is a lot of activity now, and a lot of operas are being written. But they're still trying to get into the repertoire of other countries. That'll take a while, because opera is a very expensive undertaking. And before they really will be performed, there has to be financial support for that.
Mm-hmm.
And people will need to trust then the Ukrainian music will sell.
Yeah. Which would probably require subtitles, I imagine.
Well, because but they have subtitles right now.
Right.
We do Verdi, Italian,
Yep.
Debussy, French, and Wagner, German. So because nowadays the tendency is to do the original language.
Yeah.
Except in a place like what used to be, I don't know if they still do that. The New York City Opera was the opposite. All of this is very flexible. It's evolving. Nothing stays the same. And that people tend to forget that there really is no way for, it always is fresh water you're stepping into, because it evolves in so many different ways. You saw Wagner's presentation, let's say at the end of the 19th century or close to that. There's a certain way that theater was done, with painted decorations and problems. Of course, Wagner presented a tremendous amount of production because he had, the dragon who poured forth flames and all of that, and had to be killed. And as a matter of fact, in spite of the fact that his music is long, he laughed because they were periodic when they did a production of his ring cycle. The productions, they said, we need more music because we can't fulfill everything in here without more music. He wouldn't write it, but he got somebody else that got a couple other composers who were with him in his tribe, so to speak. And they would sit down and do a good job with that. But now, of course, technology has changed all that. It was Wieland Wagner, one of his grandsons, that started a much more abstract presentation. So you didn't have all these costumes and all that. You would have costumes, but you wouldn't have this kind of rich decorative stuff, but it would be with lights. And one of them, the whole opera was played on what looked like a sphere.
Yeah.
And there's lots of stuff like that. And then recently, we saw the cycle when the Met did about a decade ago, where they had a totally new presentation of moving areas and sections, and which caused a lot of problem at first for them. But the sky's the limit.
Yeah.
Always has been, always will be, in Rome, when they did plays, and after a certain amount of decadence set in, and they had, of course, slaves be actors, and there were plenty of them to have. So if the play demanded that their heads would be cut off, well, they actually were cut off.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so, I mean, you have to sort of understand the zeitgeist to understand what's going on, and the same thing goes with this.
Yeah.